Welcome back to the YRX podcast. I'm your host, Lianna Adams, and today we're asking, why do so many DeFi projects crash and burn? From unsustainable tokenomics to security flaws, DeFi's promise often falls short. To unpack why, I'm joined by Andrew Berkowitz, CEO and co-founder of ValuesCo. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Perhaps we could start off with your professional background.
Yeah, so I graduated university 2015. Coming out of school, I really wanted to be an entrepreneur, but didn't really have family connections or money or anything to provide myself a foundation with. And so my idea was actually to start a podcast and leverage that to meet people, build a network, build a name. And so I started a podcast called The Global Startup Movement. And over the course of about 5 years, bootstrapped that into what became a media company with a portfolio of shows with the North Star focused on emerging market tech and innovation. So we had a show called African Tech Roundup based out of South Africa. My studio was based out of Washington, D.C. We had a client service model servicing all the think tanks in D.C. to produce their shows for them. And so that was kind of the kickoff to my entrepreneurial journey. And that experience really was kind of at the forefront of how the next generation was consuming media in a very different way. And in a way that was really completely subverting the traditional advertising funnel. And so I was on this kind of thought train of like, what does the future of how brands and consumers connect actually look like? And what does a society look like post interruption advertising? So 2017, ICO boom, crypto started to come onto my radar. And then in 2020, I went over, became a media fellow at the Milken Institute and had a lot of fun, as I'm sure most people on this call did during DeFi summer back in 2020. And then social tokens and NFTs as a narrative started to take shape. And that was my big light bulb moment of, okay, like this is the technology infrastructure for answering my question of like what comes next in the brand and consumer connection. And so that was the impetus of starting my company ValuesCo. We've been building this company for about 4 years now, and we have a pretty good answer for what comes next in a post-interruption advertising world.
Wow.
So that's my journey.
Big. That's quite a journey, you know. Yeah, and I'd love to ask, like, DeFi was supposed to change finance, right? But here we are, scams, collapses, and ghosted projects. What's really going on?
I mean, at its core, like we can get into the nitty gritties of tokenomics and all those things, but at its most basic, it's a human nature problem. If you all remember back in kind of Web 1, like maybe some people listening are too young, but I mean, I'm too young. I was born in 1993, but 1999, 2000, you had this massive kind of internet stock boom where you had these companies that weren't doing any revenue, but had quote unquote page views and websites, valued at tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. And so the internet kind of created this dynamic where you're able to extract capital from projects just by storytelling and just by hype building. And you didn't actually have to deliver a real product. And so that, Web 1 boom and bust happened. I think there was a much better cadence within Web 2, but then Web 3 came around and ICOs back in 2017 really, I think, was just kind of like a mirror to what happened during the Web 1 boom. And then likewise with kind of DeFi summer in 2020, like the core problem in crypto, not just DeFi, but all of crypto, is when you launch a token as a founding team and as plus the early investors, you basically are sitting on millions of dollars of liquid token. And with human nature, like, are you going to cash that out? Or are you going to maintain discipline and continue to build the product for years, despite unknown ups and downs of the market? And so that's really the core problem of crypto. It's human nature just wanting to cash out whatever can be cashed out and move on, as opposed to going through the real hero's journey to build a real meaningful thing in the world, which takes 5 to 10 years and is a long journey, is really hard, lots of ups and downs, lots of moments of not being able to make payroll. Like that's the real entrepreneurial journey. And so that entrepreneurial journey through this kind of, crypto world early exit cadence has been completely subverted just because you're able to extract a ton of capital out of projects without needing to create value. And that's the real problem.
Well, I mean, I often say that people will be peopling, right? And it just sounds like history repeats itself, from Web 1 to Web 2 and now Web 3. What's the most spectacular DeFi collapse you've seen so far, and what made it stand out?
I mean, definitely Luna. I mean, yeah, 100% Luna, because like there's DeFi projects that I could bring up that were, I guess you would call them, more controlled collapse. Like they pumped, they dumped, but like they themselves didn't take down the entire market. Whereas Luna, there was so many externalities and just kind of dominoes that fell because of different funds that were over allocated. And, there was a stable coin that like was only theoretically a stable coin. And, you had billions of dollars just kind of evaporate from the market, like within hours. And so I think that was a reckoning that completely took down the market. And really, like, it's kind of the same thing with chunk coin and Malay coin with meme coins. Like there was this kind of like underlying culture around the stuff that was building up and building up and building up, which is just like individual projects rugging that weren't big enough to like take down the entire market, but became a cultural norm of how the space was operating. And so that kind of builds up over time, normalizes a certain behavior, and you just have these risk on founders that maybe had bad intentions, maybe had good intentions. It actually doesn't really matter because this kind of normalized culture builds up into a massive explosion that breaks the narrative and just takes the entire market down. So Luna, I think, was the really culmination of just the 2020, 2021 DeFi culture building up and collapsing on itself.
Wow. And, just to circle back, we've seen projects raise millions, generate hype, and then disappear. And one of the things that you mentioned was that, it's human nature, right? Is that the most common reason behind these failures?
I would say so. I mean, we can get into the nitty gritty of like sustainable tokenomics, non-sustainable tokenomics, but the sustainable tokenomics is just tokenomics where the early founders and early investors aren't dumping their token. That's really as basic as it comes down to. And what was different about the Web 2 era versus the Web 3 era, which there was still a little bit of this in the Web 2 era, but it wasn't really as possible, where it's like you had to build a company that provided a valuable service to other people, and then they would give you money in exchange for a service. That is business. That is the right exchange of value between humans. And there wasn't really like a liquid market for equity for private companies. Like there was a secondary market that exists, but it wasn't like a liquid market. And so you had to at least create some value for other people in society in order to make money. And that's how it should be. And that's a lot of what Web 2 was, even though like there was so many kind of like VC Ponzi stuff going on behind the scenes in the secondaries world. But now in crypto, like you just aren't able to cash it out right away. There are lockups, and all those things, but it still creates a dynamic where the early investors, the early founders are just sitting on too many liquid tokens and human nature then just plays out. And that's what's happening. And that's really like, it kind of feels like the industry has been actually building up, like the meme coin stuff that happened on Solana over the past 18 months. Like it's been a buildup in the industry that has now just played out where, like there was a lot of storytelling that, this is the future of finance, and there were like some projects that were built like Aave that actually fulfilled on that promise and just didn't dump. But generally, it's you got to put yourself into these founders' shoes. Like if you were running a project that was 2 years old, you had liquid $10 million of tokens sitting in your wallet, you could either commit to this project for the next, decade of your life, and maybe it's successful, maybe it's not, or you can just take your $10 million and leave. And that's what most people are doing.
Yeah, it is human nature, but then how do we mitigate that, right? Because if otherwise, I think it's just going to keep repeating itself, right? And a lot of projects claim to be decentralized, but how many actually are, right?
There are no projects. No projects are decentralized. Every project that exists has, a handful of stakeholders that control enough token to decide what happens. Even Ethereum, like if USDC and USDT decide to fork Ethereum, everyone's going to follow. Everyone's going to have to follow because they're taking with them tens of billions of dollars of capital. And so a lot of this is decentralization theater. A lot of this is technology that has the potential for decentralization and is theoretically decentralized, but it really isn't. And that's okay. I think Bitcoin is the only real one that is decentralized. But the other problem that is introduced with Bitcoin is, even though the technology is decentralized, the allocation of ownership is way too centralized. It's even a worse system than the current banking system. There's too few people and too few entities that control too much of the Bitcoin. And that creates a problem. That creates, actually, in my opinion, a worse society than we're currently living in, because it's a more centralized ownership, even though the technology itself is decentralized. And so that's the real problem that I'm seeing. And so how do we fix that? Well, as a founder in the space, the friction that you face, that, as I would say, as a founder in the space that has the desire to build something real, meaningful, positive externalities, valuable, the challenge you face is these companies, like blockchain companies, are very expensive to build. Security, very, very small pool of engineers. Like there's a lot of things that you need budget for, and they're expensive to do right, especially at an enterprise level. We have deals with Lyft and the UN and Time Magazine, and like we need to build enterprise compliant stuff, and that's expensive to do on chain. So you need the capital, and in order to get the capital, the main source that you're going to be raising from is our crypto VCs, because they're the ones that are going to be deploying, 6, 7, 8 figures worth of capital to early stage unproven projects. And the challenge you face is negotiating lockup schedules, because investors, especially given the current market, they have the desire for as many tokens as they can get and as much percentage of early lockups as they can get. And then you, as a founder, if you want to build something sustainable, you have to push back and negotiate for a longer period of locking up these tokens. Because then, like any tokens that a VC has that's unlocked, they're probably going to dump, at least in this current state of the market. And so you have to try to raise with enough leverage where you can raise enough money to launch your token, but investors are locked up for a longer period of time, and founders. And so I think that's the core, the only real thing that I see that's actually going to make the industry better and project more sustainable is founders disciplining themselves with longer lockup periods, and then founders being able to have the leverage to raise the capital while also negotiating the VCs to be locked up for a longer period of time. That's really the only thing that I see that's going to change things.
Yeah, that's interesting. And also I wanted to kind of maybe connect back to something that you said earlier on about VC Ponzi schemes, right? And is it fair to compare, some DeFi projects to Ponzi schemes, or is that too hard?
It's okay. So, is fair to compare some DeFi projects to Ponzi schemes. It is not fair to compare DeFi projects that are producing real valuable software and aren't dumping too much token. Those I wouldn't really call those Ponzi schemes. Maybe slow motion rug pulls. Actually, I want to coin that on this podcast. Slow motion rug pulls is what they are, and it's what I said. It's just the kind of the market allowing for human nature to play out, and VCs like you can't be mad at VCs for what's happening because VCs have bosses, and a VC's job is to return as much capital as they can to their bosses. And so it's like getting angry at a pit bull for, fighting in the pit bull fight club. Like that's the game. And they're there to play the game. And it's their job to play the game. And if they don't do their job, they get fired. Or at least they, they ruin their reputation. And so again, it creates this dynamic where crypto VCs are looking to unlock as much of the token as they can, dump as much as they can, return as much capital to their LPs as they can, and then raise the next fund. And what's actually a little bit different about crypto than Web 2, in Web 2, you can raise your second, third, fourth fund based on your IRR, which is your basically unrealized return. And so as a VC, if let's say you invest in a startup at a $10 million valuation, and then that startup raises their next round at a $50 million valuation. Just to keep it simple, it's a little bit more complicated, but to keep it simple, like you're basically getting a 5x IRR. And then let's say that startup, that round doesn't really go well, like something happens, the startup sells for $30 million. Now as a investor, maybe you're getting, 2.5 or 3x on your money, but you're not able to report to your LPs anymore the theoretical 5x return that startup's next round gave you. And so we had this kind of decade-long game of Web 2 VCs really kind of dishonestly marking up their portfolio as like a 10, 20x IRR because the startups that they invested in raised a much larger round during the next round. And maybe they raised a Series B and a Series C, even though they haven't actually returned any of the capital, they have a theoretical percentage of increase. That isn't really happening as much in crypto because you as a project have a liquid token. Like your portfolio, if you are an investor back in like maybe 2017 to 2020, a lot of your projects will have launched their token. And the token is liquid on the open market, and the market kind of decides the valuation. And most projects have completely shit FDVs and market caps right now, just because of the nature of how capital has flown to meme coins. And so you now have all these investors that are showing probably a negative IRR to their investors, to their LPs. And that wasn't exactly the case in Web 2, because even shitty companies that became zombie companies, still there, because the private markets aren't liquid, their stock is still theoretically worth the previous round, right? And so in Web 2, you're able to like raise fund after fund after fund, even if you weren't producing cash because of the IRR numbers. But with crypto, it's not the case. And so it creates the issue of VCs just dumping the tokens, getting the cash out as much as they can, and trying to raise their next fund.
Yeah, I love how you've termed it slow motion rug pulls.
I know. I've never said that before, actually.
That is so.
I like it.
That
I like it.
I really like it too. You should definitely get that out there, right? Like
Yeah.
coin this. It's a
Yeah.
slow motion rug pull. Uh, and I've also heard once, that VCs are like hitchhikers with credit cards. They get into your car, and as long as you take them where they want to get to, which is an exit, they'll stay in the car, right? And they do have a different agenda, and they want to exit the car, but they don't want to exit the car too soon. They like to have the compounding occur, right? And you're so right. VCs are beholden to their own investors, and yeah. So it just makes me think about: do you think founders launch projects knowing they won't last? I mean, or do you think it's a more of a naive thing, or do you think it's more of the VCs that are at play here?
It's on a case by case basis. I mean, you never really know the real like internal intention of a person when it comes to any given endeavor or project, right? Um, so I think that most first time founders are naive, just by nature of like, you don't know what you don't know. And there's definitely a game to successful TGEs. That game involves market makers and exchanges and VCs and tokenomic firms and influencers. And it's not that it's a complicated game, but like you have to learn the game to play the game. And I think learning the game in crypto inherently makes you a much more cynical operator than when you are more kind of like, naively coming in with the intention of building something real and meaningful. And so I think second time crypto founders probably don't have the same kind of pure intentions as first time founders, because most first time token founders, they probably got dumped on by their VCs, dumped on by their influencers, dumped on by their market makers, and, charged 50, 60, 70, 80, 100K plus 1% of their token to get listed on exchanges. And so it's this weird thing where it's like, if you're a honest founder in the space, like it's very difficult to attract honest players across all the different stakeholders that you need to get your token live and make it successful. And that creates this kind of, again, these like short-term incentive mechanisms. And so, okay, so that's the first part of the question. Then your second part, like, do VCs have good intentions? And then that gets back to my point earlier where it actually doesn't matter, because VCs have a job to do, which is extract as much cash from the projects that they're investing in as they can, because they have bosses that gave them a lot of money and are trusting them with that money. And so that's the job of the VC. And so you can, as a VC, like you can have a positive intention, but it really doesn't matter because you have a job to do, which is to extract capital for your LPs.
Your hands are tied, kind of.
Yeah. And so like there are different types of VCs. There are VCs that have a lot of external LP capital, and those LPs only want a return. They don't care about anything else. And that's, I would say, most VCs. There are some other VCs that like they are the largest LPs in their own fund, and they're looking to really invest in projects and be involved in projects on a decade-long timeline. Those are going to be the best investors. Those are going to be investors that, obviously they want a return, but if they're independently wealthy and they seeded their own VC fund, at least with like one of the larger checks, they have a little bit more autonomy to actually be passionate about a project and want to see it successful long term and have more incentives to hold the token and support the token than other funds. I think for us, like we've raised about a little over $3 million since we started in 2021. And in terms of like percentage, like we have about 50% from really mission-aligned angel investors and venture philanthropists, and the other 50% from crypto VCs. And so I think it's also a founder's responsibility to do their best to curate the cap table in a way where you're bringing on value-added investors that you trust more than others to not dump tokens. It's a very hard game as a founder, especially with the market and the way it's been over the past few years. Like your first job as the founder is to keep the company alive and get cash in the door. And so sometimes you're in a position where it's actually very difficult to try to curate the cap table and decide who gets to be on the cap table versus, being able to curate some of the cap table, but then kind of being in a position where you've got to take some money from VCs that, you don't know you don't know them. You don't know their intention. You don't know what they're going to do. It's part of the game.
Yeah, it's pretty complex, isn't it? And if regulation forced full transparency tomorrow, how many DeFi projects would survive, do you think?
Sorry, what was the question?
So if regulation forced full transparency tomorrow, how many DeFi projects would survive?
Got it. How many DeFi projects would survive? Well, I mean, in some ways, there is a lot of transparency. You need a spotlight shined on the project, and you need kind of more expert on-chain analysts. Like Zach XBT is a great example of someone on crypto Twitter that, like, if he's motivated to like investigate a project, he'll be able to really kind of track different on-chain movements and different wallets that hold tokens and all these things. But I would say, well, I mean, first off, it's not going to happen. Like there's not going to be that type of legislation. And even if there was, there's still going to be ways to game and manipulate the system. And so people will just find ways to game and manipulate the system in a different way than they're currently doing. And so the market will adapt to that. And so I think some DeFi projects will probably would not survive in that dynamic theoretically, but I think that it would just kind of, do more to expose what at this point everybody already knows, which is we're in this game of like VCs investing in infrastructure projects, the infrastructure projects doing a ton of storytelling to paint this massive, bright vision. And they're really just focused on the token as the product and not the actual software or tech that they're building as the product. And that's really the biggest problem.
Yeah, and it kind of comes back to like people will be peopling, right? And it talks to the human nature. If you had to create a survival guide for DeFi projects, what would be the number one rule?
I mean, the number one rule would just be lockups. That's it. That's it. I mean, the reality is like any sustainable endeavor needs to make profit. If you're not making profit, you're going out of business. And so we've had this game of nobody caring about revenue or profit and just focused on how do we make the token price go up? That's it. And so what needs to happen is we need to have projects that are making revenue. And when like revenue is a sign of value. Like the way a business is supposed to work is you start something, you build a product that creates value for other human beings, and those other human beings give you money because that product is creating value for them. That's how a business is supposed to work. Product or service. And so DeFi projects need to have transaction fees. They need to maybe have, B2B or some type of service model, but they need to make revenue so that there's US dollars flowing into the machine and making it sustainable. Otherwise, it's not sustainable. It's not possible to be sustainable. So that's what needs to happen. So it's more of like, there needs to be a revenue model. And if there's not a revenue model, then the thing can't survive.
Wow, I love that. I love how you've explained it. Is there anything you'd like to add?
To my last point, or just generally?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just generally, as we kind of wrap up the show.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the game of slow motion rug pulls is up, and that's the case because everyone's figured it out. Everyone is aware of like this, like, low float, high FDV game, and the fact that these VCs have just been manipulating token prices over the past few years to dump on retail. And then you had meme coins, which was kind of, everyone told the story that meme coins are a way for retail to finally make it in crypto. But then the way it played out is the same exact thing, except this time it's not the VCs that are dumping on you. It's Solana insiders that are dumping on you. And so the game has been kind of like recycled and rewashed, and kind of like new stories have been told. And so I'm hoping now that we're in a place where everyone realizes that the gig is up and people start to build real projects that make money and are sustainable. And I hope that's what is about to happen.
Yeah, I'm hopeful too. But if you had to call it, would there be another kind of slow motion rug pull that you can kind of like think of or anticipate?
I mean, of course, like again, like when it comes down to the problem of human nature tied to founders and investors having too much liquid tokens too early in a project's life cycle. And when that happens, people take their money off the table. It kind of sucks. I mean, money is energy. And so you're basically sucking all the energy out of the company at a stage where you need to be adding energy into the company. And until that stops, the whole industry will just be slow motion rug pulls, and it's not going to change.
Oh man, I really hope it will change, and we'll see the end of slow motion rug pulls. Andrew, this has been a fascinating deep dive into why so many DeFi projects fail and what it takes to build something that lasts. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
For those listening, what do you think is the biggest challenge in DeFi? Let us know on social media. Until next time, thanks for tuning in to the YRX podcast.